I think that shalom, everyone. First of all, very happy to be here. For me, the local Bay Area is Haifa, and I just landed at 6 a.m. And very excited to be here at what's been in our minds for many, many months, being a part of the coalition of organizations dealing with Israel and U.S.-Jewry relationship back home for quite some months now. And it's, first of all, it's a great feeling, and it's exciting to actually come to the day and sit here and do this and have real people come. So I want to start by thanking you for that. So I think that there's no doubt in the fact that Israel as an issue is present on U.S. campuses way more than U.S. Jewry is present on Israeli campuses. That is, and Tracy related to it in her opening, that is definitely a fact. The problem is, I think, starts with the fact that Israel, the issue, is present on American campuses way more than Israel, the place, or Israel, the people. And when we're living in an era where a 6-second soundbite is the most that you can give to the world in terms of your attention span, then it's very easy to get the subtitles and you know what sells newspapers, what makes the news. And as Jessica said, a lot of the good things that are happening are not there on the news. One thing that we need to be aware of, I think, because again, this conference and this unique conference this year of establishing the Z3 movement, and I hope you've all been to the opening plenary and understood what our speakers were talking about. I think that it's important to realize that dancing around the elephant in the room or ignoring the elephant in the room is not going to get us to any better place than when we are. And I think that sometimes, and on campuses, and I'd love to hear the students' view on that as well, sometimes what we do on campuses, and we do it in Jewish organizations as well, and I have some criticism to our own Hillel as an organization that we both, Jessica and I, work with, and I'd love to hear what you think about it as well. But many times we go and deal with the things that are as important, but are easier to deal with. So we find ourselves, in my eyes, looking at it from Israel, I find that sometimes it's easier for us to deal with Me Too campaigns, with wellness of students, and we're bringing up some real issues that need to be attended to. But sometimes it's easier to deal with those issues than to deal with Israel. And how do I see Israel? And what do I do with BDS? And how do I answer it? And how do I reconcile, as an American student, how do I reconcile criticism to the state of Israel and its current government with my support or my want to have support to the state of Israel as a notion? And I think that this is where the core of the problem lies. I think we're dealing too much with Israeli politics and too less with Israel education, and that might be the place to start changing. I'll suffice with that for now, in order to move on, and I'll be happy to get back to some more ideas later.
Okay, I do want to thank everyone for being here. As a person who has spent most of their life in New York and/or Israel, we are much larger Jewish communities, and seeing just this many people who care about Israel, care about the Jewish people, it's comforting for me. It fills me with hope. In terms of where I stand, I myself was born in New York. My father, as you may guess, is Ashkenazi, and my mother is a Yemenite Jew, actually. And just speaking about that and getting to a college campus and having this aspect of people will know about latkes, people will know about dreidels, people will know about the Holocaust, people will know about Ashkenazi Jewry, and this will also play into intersectionality, where although I am not a believer in intersectionality, and although I know that puts me completely on the other side of the spectrum, I do think that Jews have been labeled as white, and we have labeled ourselves as white, although for a long time in history, we have not been treated as such. And I've spoken to my peers, and they are not Jewish, not Muslim. They have no relation to the Middle East whatsoever. They aren't involved in politics, and yet they can name for me the last 5 occurrences in which Israel has done something questionable and/or controversial with regards to Palestine, and they got that information from BDS or JVP. both student organizations on our campus, which from what I've seen on many campuses, from when I've visited Yale, Columbia, etc., are usually led by Jewish students. And for me, that is one of the most challenging things in the sense that I spent a quarter of my life in Israel, and I consider joining the IDF. I have cousins I have a cousin who's 2 weeks younger than I am, and a cousin who's a month younger than I am, and we were all meant to join together, and I decided that I would do something meaningful here instead. And the conversation went from in Israel discussing, okay, who are the Jewish people, how do we address this, to coming to a college campus, and the Jews themselves don't know about the diversity of their history, the diversity of their people. Latkes and dreidels are more common than jachnun or kubana, and if you don't know what those are delicious oily foods that come from the Yemenite culture. And you have the Indian Jews, and I actually just this past week met an Ethiopian Jew on our campus who has not once been to our Hillel, and our Hillel has done a great job in terms of, we actually have this map in our specific Hillel in which, where are you from in the world, and we have many Latin American Jews. And I think that for me, I see the Jewish people as this sort of family, and when I see that people within the context of our home, within these conversations, want to criticize Israel and have good intentions, I'm beyond ecstatic, and I will join, and I will not criticize, but seek to help. Whereas when you walk outside of your home and you are seeking to just create problems, and you will tell people can name for me how many Palestinians have died in the past year. They will not know the context, they will not know what they were doing, they will not know the cases, but they can't name for me a single country in the Middle East that the Jews were kicked out of. They have no knowledge of the history. And I think that we need to create separate spheres. Our public personas should be strongly supportive of Israel, and our private conversations, when we're speaking amongst ourselves and we're trying to help the Jewish future together, we're trying to help Israel, then we can criticize.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you to the OFJCC for having me. This is my third time at Z3, so I'm honored to actually be returning as a speaker. And of course, I'm a lifelong Bay Area resident, so it brings me incredible pride to see the Jewish future being imagined here. I want to begin by agreeing with Rabbi K that when I pitch an article to the Forward that for the 5th straight week we have an excellent Shabbat dinner, no one wants to write that, and no one wants to read that in the Jewish community. And so I do want to second that the perception and what's being put out in media is disproportionately skewed toward the negative, because no one's telling you about all the exciting stuff that's happening. And I want to give a shout out to Rabbi K for making that happen on our campus, and to Yaron Eva, Yaron for introducing Yemenite culture. He led an alternate blessing over challah with matzah last night at our Shabbat dinner 2 nights ago, and that's just one of those simple things that is creating rich Jewish life. No one's writing an article about that. 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of going to a co-op Shabbat that Eva put on, where we just sat around with challah that one of our students had baked. And so there's so much happening, even with individual students putting on stuff that they care about that you're not hearing about. Tracy asked some pretty deep tachlis questions, so I'm just going to get into it and follow Yaron's lead on this. I'm a Zionist. I've had a Zionist upbringing. I'm from a I'm from a standard conservative Jewish home. Capital C conservative is in the movement. I'm one of the few denominationalists left out there. Like the conservative movement as a whole, I often struggle with whether or not I'm a religious Jew who is a Zionist or a religious Zionist, meaning I'm a person who keeps Shabbat and cares about kosher, and I care about Israel, so do I think that there's religious significance to Israel? I don't know, I'm working on figuring out, but I'm a fan of Israel in the meantime. And on the peoplehood question, I would say there are 3 main things that I think I've learned in almost 4 years at Stanford. One is that we're not on the same page about what it means when we say peoplehood. That's pretty vague if we don't have a sense of who is the Jewish people. I think the first panel talked about that a little, so I don't want to get two and two what the plenary was saying about disagreeing over who is a Jew, but just in terms of who we consider to be our people, who are we responsible for, are we all one people, is the family metaphor working? At Zionism 3.0, 3 years ago, Yehuda Kurtzer introduced the metaphor that maybe we're not a family, maybe we're shared descendants of a common ancestor, and as difficult as that is to say, I think potentially that's an apt metaphor to recognize the fractured state of global Jewry. So that's one thing, definitions. The second is that it's not clear exactly what we want peoplehood to be and what we want that to do for us. So for example, I think that in modern Orthodoxy, the idea of Klal Yisrael has really taken off. Soloveitchik introduced this. In the 70s, he said there's a sense of Klal Yisrael, of the community of Israel, we're all one, we should look out for each other. Chabad is obviously big proponents of this. And so I think there's a religious framework in which you can have a sense of like the people Israel. But I want to think about peoplehood as a secular idea and think about what that looks like in Jewish communities, regardless of observance, and I don't think we're doing that, nor do I necessarily know what that would look like. The third thing is that we don't really talk about peoplehood that much. We talk about Israel a lot, but we don't talk so much about peoplehood. In high school, I was in BBYO, which I actually think did an incredible job of thinking about Jewish peoplehood and what it means to be part of global Jewry, but that hasn't been a part as much of my Jewish conversations in college. I think that when peoplehood comes up, it's in response to anti-Semitism. So what do I know about European Jewry? I know that 60% of Brits think that Jeremy Corbyn's an anti-Semite. I know that 70% of French Jews are afraid to wear a kippah. I know that a guy was stabbed outside the Israeli consulate in Belgium, right? But I'll be honest, I don't know so much about global Jewry aside from the anti-Semitism they're experiencing, and I think that's when it comes up, both globally and domestically. We think about other Jewish communities. When there was a hurricane in Texas, so we raised money for Houston. We're thinking about how to support Tree of Life after the mass shooting, but we're not thinking proactively about how we can connect to other communities, both in our country and around the world.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to Tracy and thank you to the OFJCC. I'm Eva Borbart. I'm the president of the J Street U National Student Board. And I think on the question of peoplehood, one time when this came up pretty recently for me was in the wake of the Pittsburgh attack. And I actually found myself during that attack leading a J Street U workshop of 40 Jewish students in LA. And I think leading those 40 students through that weekend in particular was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done. And there was a moment when I was on the third floor of UCLA Hillel, like skipping out on a session by myself just to try and pull myself together, like sobbing, because this was the first time a shooting had happened where like the people could have been my grandparents. And this like little old man came out of a luncheon on that floor and was like, "Hey, do you need a hug?" And for me, like some moments like that are some of what peoplehood is, in terms of like sharing our grief, sharing our joy, learning about different traditions that we might not know about. And I think that episode in particular is emblematic of some of the questions and critiques that I have about peoplehood as well. Because what I did, I had to lead a plenary session 3 minutes later. So I pulled myself together, went downstairs, got up in front of this room of Jewish students, and was talking about how I think I wanted the space to just solely grieve in the wake of that attack. I wanted to be able to mourn as one Jewish people. And I was finding that there were outside forces that were preventing my ability to do that in terms of President Trump, like using the massacre to campaign for the death penalty, Naftali Bennett coming to the States and then like campaigning for the Republican Party while he was supposed to be helping us mourn. And I think we talk about being one Jewish people, but some of Israel's actions and also the way that Israel has like fractured the domestic politics of the Jewish community in particular, in terms of the question of unconditional support versus like wanting Israel to reflect values of equality that much of the American Jewish community holds, is fracturing our community. And I think J Street U students are not inappropriately politicizing a space when we bring that up. My introduction to Jewish life and Israel advocacy was I was initially basically pushed out of the Jewish community altogether. I was politicized during the Ferguson uprising. I lived 20 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri. And I was there, I wanted to be a rabbi at the time. And I was watching my rabbi like handing out water at this protest and feeling like, this is my Judaism, these are my Jewish values, we're acting on civil rights, we're here as a Jewish community showing up. And then a sort of Free Palestine contingent went by in this march, and I felt ripped into. I felt like free Palestine, like what about Israel? What about Israelis? Like where do they fit into this kind of rhetoric that feels sort of erasing and negating? And at the same time, I was like, okay, I see some of the connections that are being drawn here in terms of Palestinians in the West Bank and black people in America trading tips on Twitter about how to deal with tear gas. And I want to be able to hold those two things together. And getting to college and finding J Street U was the place where I realized that like the way to hold my values of social justice and equality and my values of caring for Israel, caring for Israelis, and I think Jewish peoplehood is really a part of this, the way to hold those together are by actively working toward an Israel that is consistent with those values. And that is what has brought me to J Street U. And J Street U has brought me back into Hillel. Like one of the first Shabbat I went to at Stanford was halfway through the year in December. Jacob actually invited me. We were in the same freshman dorm. And the thing that you said, Jacob, was, hey, you know that the entire J Street U board goes to Shabbat every week. You know that Zoe and Julia and all those people are going to be there. And I was like, what? Like, and so J Street U students are kind of the sort of left flank of the sort of acceptable spectrum in the Jewish community. So many of us find ourselves in Hillel. We're sort of the leftmost end of the people that can credential ourselves in the way that Rabbi K did at the beginning of this, in terms of we support Zionism, we support Jewish peoplehood, all of these things. But also, a value we're holding is equality. And the way we express that value is like deeply, deeply needing to change the status quo and to actively be working toward a more just future for Israel. And so some students find that by like working within the Jewish community and telling our elders and telling our parents, like, hey, we're here too. We care about Israelis, we care about Palestinians, and we want to work with you. And we want so badly to see our institutions reflect those values so that we can stay here. And some of us, like I've also started hosting co-op Shabbats and creating alternative, vibrant Jewish communities on campus that are just founded on the premise of those values. Jewishness and equality, care for Israelis and care for Palestinians, and refusing to let one of those fall to the side when we discuss politics in terms of an understanding of current events that is really grounded in both like the experience of Middle Eastern Jews who were pushed out of their countries and Palestinians who were pushed out of their homes in 1948, and holding both and refusing to negate one. And so that's what some of these mean to me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So going off of what you said, there's this rising trend of intersectionality playing out on college campuses where one's identity and identity politics are championed over one's ideas. And that comes into play when Jewish students come into liberal social justice spaces and they're asked to renounce their Zionism, to renounce their connection to Israel in order to participate. I want to know how that's playing out, how that has impacted the Jewish community, and how you're able to hold your Jewish values, your connection to Israel within those spaces. And then I'm going to go down to you, Ilan and Jessica, and I want to know, what is the role of Jewish campus organizations in creating a space where all of these ideas can be included? How do you build a broad tent where anyone can come in without asking questions of, are you pro-Israel? Are you a Zionist? How do you build a coalition of students in a space where we can have these open conversations and create a level of nuance and complexity around these issues? So I'm gonna go back to you.
Oh, sure. So recently, also in the wake of the Frydberg attack, there was a vigil on campus, which many of us were at, and there was only one explicit mention in that vigil. Okay, well, first of all, there was a call to attend the vigil, like asking other communities on campus to show up for the Jewish community in our time of grieving. Which felt really, really important, and I think everyone felt really vulnerable about whether or not that was going to happen. And what did happen is Ujima, which is a Black student-themed dorm on campus, rolled out and showed up 30 people in matching shirts. And in that vigil, there was only one mention of the Kroger shootings that had happened that week where 2 unarmed Black people were also killed. Only one explicit mention of the fact that the Black community was also feeling a pretty similar kind of pain, and a moment of connection was sort of lost. And even while the vigil was appropriately focused on the pain that the Jewish community was feeling in this moment. And it reminds me of another conversation that a student recounted to me where we were upset that people weren't showing up for anti-Semitism on campus, and then someone raised, well, what about Black Lives Matter? We haven't showed up for that. And someone said, oh, well, that would be political. It's we're talking about 2 communities' pain here, and we can't say that our pain isn't political and everyone should universally support it while your pain isn't. So that's the non-Israel related answer. And the Israel-related answer is twofold. A few years ago, there was a resolution to recognize and reaffirm the fight against anti-Semitism on Stanford's campus. And that resolution contained basically the State Department definition of anti-Semitism, which is very similar to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that is currently in Congress. And it basically defines delegitimization of the State of Israel as anti-Semitic. Our original resolution defined anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, which basically would label all of the activism of Students for Justice in Palestine, for example, as anti-Semitic and try and get that group labeled as a hate group. And it was just sort of very clear what the line would be. And it would also, incidentally, label groups like Jewish Voice for Peace as anti-Semitic groups for their anti-Zionist stance. So J Street U basically was we actually need a new definition of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And the reason for that was because we want other groups on campus to be able to show up for anti-Semitism and to show up when actual anti-Semitic things happen without feeling like it's going to be made entirely about Israel. And so, we know that anti-Semitism sometimes comes up in discussions of Israel. So how do we address that? And we talked to everyone. We talked to the then president of the JSA. We talked to SJP. We talked to SIA, Stanford Israel Alliance, and pro-Israel groups. And we're basically okay, how do we craft a resolution that basically parses out when is it about Israel and politics and nationalism? College students love to discuss nationalism, but when are you only calling out Jewish nationalism and not Palestinian nationalism or other kinds of nationalism as the worst thing ever to happen to the world? And can we actually start to parse some of these things out? And we crafted this original definition of anti-Semitism that passed unanimously through the Senate and also started a conversation on campus of okay, what is this form of hatred that actually not a lot of us know a lot of things about? And I think J Street U was positioned pretty well to sort of facilitate some of that and reach a lot of those different groups because we have a stance that is against the occupation and so at least are acknowledging that the status quo is really broken and that Palestinians are suffering in a way that allows us to connect with other progressive groups. And when we are in conversations with those groups, we refuse to let Zionism be a litmus test for whether those partnerships can exist or not. We identify as a pro-Israel organization and come to conversations in that frame. And so we're both challenging and also listening, and we're sort of positioned to be able to moderate between a lot of these different groups on campus. And I think that results in some really, really important conversations like the nature of anti-Semitism and how it fits into all these other forms of oppression, which is sort of what intersectionality is about.
Fantastic, thank you. And then in terms of what that means as creating a space within Hillel to allow for all of these Jewish students and individuals to be welcome and to create a space where all of them can come without creating a checklist to go through before they can participate. What does that look like? How do you build that?
Do we get a response?
Oh, yeah.
Do you guys want to go first?
I would love to.
I will say one of the things we try to do at Hillel is center the voices of students. So,
I also want to hear from my rabbi. So I'm going to list all the ways I disagree with Eva because no one wants to hear all the ways I agree. But I will just highlight that I think Eva's articulation of how we should be relating to Israel, some of Israel's actions have fractured the Jewish community. I think it's pretty hard to disagree with that. And we should all be striving for the Israel that we want to see. I think that's beautiful sentiment, and I think that is definitely one of the callings of Z3. So with the episode you're talking about from a few years ago over the resolution on anti-Semitism, I think one of the things that we're struggling to articulate as a community is saying there are some anti-Semitic anti-Zionisms, there are some non-anti-Semitic anti-Zionisms, and I think too often being able to say, well, it's anti-Zionism, therefore it's not anti-Semitism, is a get out of anti-Semitism free card, right? So I'm not comfortable saying it's anti-Zionism, therefore it's anti-Semitism, but I'm also not comfortable with people who say it's just anti-Zionism, therefore it's not anti-Semitism by virtue of being about Israel. I think that's wrong as well. I'm sorry?
Can you define what you mean by anti-Zionism?
Sure, by anti-Zionism, I'm referring to the idea that there should not be a sovereign Jewish state. So a binational state is, I would consider anti-Zionism. The idea that it should, I don't need to get into the weeds about it. If anyone wants to correct my definition.
Define Zionist, and then people will understand what
anti-Zionism?
A state for the Jews. I think that the example, and that's very tentative. I think that the example you're talking about with the anti-Semitism resolution is actually a very good example of where anti-Semitism is not at all about Israel. Because in that context, a student senator then got up and said, well, hold on, this says something about Jews controlling the banks and the government and the media, and, well, yeah, you know, that's probably true, that sounds right. And a bunch of Jewish students said, well, hold on, do you realize what you're saying? And he dug in his heels and said, no, I do mean that. Jews do control the media and the government. And so after future conversations, he then again dug in his heels and said that this is an acceptable thing to say. And so this raised all our anti-Semitism flags. It was the most anti-Semitism I've experienced in 4 years on a college campus, was a student saying to my face, Jews control the government. And I think this is an example of intersectionality failing the Jews, is that his endorsement was not rescinded. He was running for re-election, and the Students of Color Coalition, who, like Eva, I want to turn to as allies, and whose allies I want to be, and who I certainly agree post-Pittsburgh really, really showed up for us, they failed us, and I don't think they adhered to what I would view as an intersectional principle that actually, this has nothing to do with Israel. So when someone says Jews control the media and the government, other minorities that have been scapegoated and victimized should be the first ones to our rescue. And it was really disappointing to not see that. So to me, that's a failure of intersectionality. And I'll also note that that Senate, in that resolution, said that they're going to receive yearly training about anti-Semitism, and every year I contact them to schedule it, and it has never once happened. So to me, again, a failing of intersectionality. I think that it's hard to say point blank intersectionality is good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. I think it can be good for the Jews. I think there are many instances of failed intersectionality. I'm sure many people read about the Dyke March in Chicago, where someone put up an Israeli flag. A bunch of queer Jews came to celebrate their identities. And the intersectionality is precisely about that, the intersection of marginalized identities, and the fact that they weren't allowed to celebrate the Jewish dimension of their identity as marginalized queer people, to me, is a shanda. But I think that there are examples of intersectionality working. For example, at the vigil, the Black diaspora-themed house showing up for us, the Muslim community wrote handwritten notes to the Jewish community and emailed them to myself and Rabbi K. And I do see those as being animated by intersectionality. So it has its goods and its evils. And I think one of the things that we do have to continue to negotiate as a Jewish community, in Eva's words, is Zionism as a litmus test. Is, do we have a litmus test? Do we care? What are the principles that are going to guide us? I know, for example, right now with the Women's March, this isn't necessarily about anti-Zionism, but there are lots of problematic things about Jews that have come out of the mouths of the organizers of the Women's March. And so it's really a discussion we should be having of, well, if this is a cause we care about, do we have the right to impose the litmus test, or should we just march for women's equality? So those are the things I want to be on our minds.
But really quick.
Yeah, very
Sorry.
short. Just 4 minor points, very, very short.
This is the standard version of short.
I unfortunately could not attend the Pittsburgh vigil, but in terms of the examples that were, I too had trouble because I do think it was politicized, and I do think that the Republicans, as well as the Democrats on campus, did that, and regardless, I think the fact that it was politicized was problematic for me, and I think that what blurs the lines for me between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism would be when we're creating double standards for Israel and people who aren't involved in politics otherwise, who clearly would not be judging any other country, are demonizing Israel. And when you have just explicit delegitimization, and similar to what Jacob had said, and I think you developed it really well, and I actually recall going to the Apartheid Week every single year at Columbia to be part of the Israel group, and you just would have this complete blurring of the lines where they assumed we didn't speak Arabic, and so I understand some Arabic, and the explicit anti-Semitism that came out of their mouths was scary. So just that is what it is.
Okay. Great. So we're going to keep it moving. I want to start talking about when we look forward at building the ideas of Jewish peoplehood, an idea of a shared Zionism, what that looks like moving forward on a college campus. So Alon, I'm going to start with you, and then Jessica, I want you to come in on this one. How, during a young student's time on college campuses, both in Israel and across the Jewish world, can we start building a mindset of a shared people? Is it about more programming? Is it about creating a reverse birthright where we're not just investing millions of dollars in American Jews coming to Israel, but in Israelis coming and experiencing what American Jewish life looks like? What, on an institutional level, do we need to do to build this shared idea of peoplehood starting on college campuses? What does that look like?
If I had one word to answer this question, and I'm not a graduate of Stanford, so I can do some things with one word.
Fantastic.
And,
Not yet either.
no, I know, not yet. It's only going to get worse, right? But if I would have had one word to answer this,
Yes.
I would say encounters. And if I had two words, I would say significant encounters, because that's what it's all about. The idea of peoplehood, growing up in Israel again, and that's one of the issues that we're experiencing now, and hopefully are beginning to change. For example, sitting here right now, American Jewry or diaspora Jewry for a native Israeli who's born, and raised in Jerusalem, American Jewry was talking to us from plaques. Because you could see an ambulance going out in the street and it would be donated by Harry and Jeanette from Florida. And you go into your JCC for your chess afternoon class, and it would say on the classroom, this classroom was donated by these and that from Atlanta. And these were diaspora Jewry. And there was this some kind of an unspoken, unwritten pact saying, we're going to be here holding the fort, going to the army, doing everything that needs to be done that you cannot do from outside of the house. And the other half will, bring in the resources. And there were hardly any names and encounters as a result of this relationship. I remember finding out in my current position today as Hillel, and I've been in this position now for almost 6 years, but it's a little bit over 20 years in the realm of Israel diaspora relations and Zionist education. And all of my roles prior to that were on how to serve American Jewry and strengthen your Jewish identity by exposing you to Israel. You need to see how strong Israel is. You need to know how relevant Israel is for you. Because if you don't happen to go to congregations, and if you don't daven, and if you're not, you might lose it. And it's our role as the sovereign state of the Jews to make sure that you keep being Jewish, and our Israel could be the way to get you, into the loop again. And that was always a problem. And for decades now, we've been sending shlichim, emissaries, to summer camps, to youth movements, to all kind of seminars, to campuses, Israel Fellows on campuses, to congregations even, synagogues, and definitely to federations. And when those shlichim are being trained in Israel, the best of our people in Israel, when they're being trained to go in shlichut, they're being trained to export their Judaism into the diaspora. Sorry, to export their Israelism into the diaspora. All that they teach them, and not because it's a scam. It's not a conspiracy. It's because that's what it's about. Take your Israeliness and export it to the diaspora, because those guys in the diaspora, they need to learn about it. When I was going on shlichut, we practically took 4 boxes of educational materials with us. Today, the shlichim go with 1 disk on key, but that's just because of Israeli technology. It just got easier physically. But the idea is the same idea. Nobody ever tells those Israeli Jews when they go on shlichut, and when they're being told to export their Israeliness, nobody tells them how much Judaism they're going to be importing back. And this cliche of those Israelis coming back from shlichut and saying, I went as an Israeli, but I came back a Jew, that is the most amazing thing that needs to be pinpointed, and that's where the conversation needs to start from. Because growing up in Israel, you can go through an entire socialization process without mentioning the other half of the family who doesn't live at home. And when being asked, what is Judaism for you? You would say, well, Judaism is a religion. I'm not religious, therefore it's not for me. We can move on to the next question. There's no actual notion of a 3,000 years of history, of a set of values, of why were we put on the planet. Israelis, if we don't bring them together, and again, the word is encounters, if we don't bring them together, they will keep on relating to Israel as their state, and Israel to Israelis will become like France is to the French or Canada to the Canadian. And that's, I think, a risk, because Israelis will suffice with a 70 years miraculous story of a young, successful nation, but will forget a 3,000 years of story where two sides of the same family happen to take two different turns in one junction and keep on living and thriving where they are. And it was said in the opening panel, two very strong Jewish communities. 85% of our family is split between those two halves. And those two halves are thriving right now. But if they lose the connection between them, and it is about siblings as opposed to friends or even marriages. Because when my sister moved to Connecticut, she did not stop being my sister. And where our father was sick, she was not out of the loop because she's not in Israel anymore. Lehefech, she was even more involved because she's not there and she can't see it, and I had to update her exactly what's happening so that we can decide together. That's what family is about, and I think this is the core of that issue. And one final sentence, I think where BDS and anti-Israel and SJP and JVP and whatever, where all those organizations on campuses here on American soil have succeeded is in one thing, to steal the agenda. Because Hillel professionals in this country used to wake up in the morning and do Jewish stuff with Jewish students and teach them about Israel and engage them with their Jewish peoplehood and talk to them about why we were put on this planet and how did we do all those great things that we do. And once the actual threats of BDS, Israel is not going to be isolated, and no boycott was ever accepted by an actual university. Student governments here and there. What happened the next day after a student government accepts and votes yes for a BDS resolution? What happens the next day? Big secret. Nothing. That's not the problem. And J Street U, these views back home in Israel, guys, that's mainstream. That's what I mean. The half of the country in Israel is J Street U. If you look at pro-Israel, wanting it to be successful and have a lot of criticism about what's being done right now. This is what we need to be careful at, not to let this agenda being stolen from us, because we need to deal with building the gap, bridging the gap between those two sides of the Jewish people.
Beautifully said. So, Jessica, as a Jewish professional, what does that look like? How do you not let BDS control the conversation? And how do you create a space where shared ideas, the sense of shared peoplehood, can flourish, so that when these young people leave campus, they leave stronger, more connected, to take on leadership positions as young professionals and moving forward?
I think it's a bunch of things, and I will say this to frame it, and I think this actually gets back to a question you asked earlier. Part of the dance that we are trying to do as a Hillel at this moment, and I think this is what most Hillels are trying to do, is balance between the needs of our campus and the perceived needs of the community off campus, who is deeply concerned about what is happening on campus and finds what happens on campus to be challenging to their own sense of Jewishness, Jewish identity, belonging, Zionism, etc. And so we are learning that sometimes what is the right answer for campus looks like a terrible answer off campus, and what to off campus seems so logical is actually a terrible answer when you're on campus. And that is sort of the whipsaw that we live in between. One of the ways that we have tried to navigate that, and it is an imperfect point to land on, so I hope that it is somewhat temporary, though I don't know how long temporary is to say that in terms of Jewish students, if you think of yourself as a Jewish student, Hillel is for you. You belong, we want you at Shabbat, we want to take you to coffee, we want to help you envision your passion project for campus and make that happen. Every Jewish student is our mission. But if you are a Jewish student group who cannot say Israel should exist as a Jewish state with safe and secure borders, then we can't support you as a Jewish group. And we are asking 18 and 19-year-olds to parse the difference between accepting them as an individual Jewish soul and the group that they feel passionately affiliated with and often see as like they're driven there out of their Jewish values and Jewish experiences. And we're asking them to sort of make a mechitza, if you will, between those things. And it's the position that we're in. I hope it's not the position that we're in forever, because I don't think that it's really tenable in a long-term way.
Where would you want it to be?
That's another. That's another conversation, which we should talk about in Denver. We're going to be at the Hillel Professional Conference starts tomorrow, so all the Hillel professionals, right? You're welcome to join us, where I think we'll be hashing out many of these things. But Tracy, in terms of your question about what are we doing, let me give you a little example out of my life and then about what we're trying to do on campus as part of this. When I was a junior at Berkeley, I was a Hillel Fellow when I went to Hebrew University. I did my junior year abroad at Hebrew U, and I was a Hillel Fellow, which is something I knew about because I'd been involved in my Hillel back home. And being a Hillel Fellow there meant I knew where the Hillel was on campus, which I think most Israelis did not at that point, but we're now talking about 20 years ago. And I had a little bit of money and a cohort to create programming on campus about Jewish life. And the best part was, we got to be part of this trip that then went to the Ukraine and led Passover Seders for Ukrainian Jews who'd chosen not to be part of the exodus that either made Aliyah or came to America, but instead were still trying to be Jewish in Ukraine in 1999. That was an incredible experience for me because it taught me what it was to travel with a Jewish lens and to actually experience a different diaspora community that didn't have the position of strength that we did in America, but was still holding on and had its own important stories. And then to go back to Jerusalem and be part of what was happening there, that intersection of experiences was transformative for me in terms of my understanding of what it meant to be a Jew in the world. That is the kind of experience that we want to create for our students as well. So for example, Stanford students, many of them study abroad, multiple quarters. They go to different places. We are creating a new program that will launch this coming quarter to support them as Jewish students when they're traveling, to encourage them to use a Jewish lens when they're in Paris, to help connect them with Jewish communities there, to help them navigate the security of going to a Shabbat service. They're not used to the fact that you have to hand over your passport on your way in. We need to teach them some of that, but we also want to teach them what's wonderful about traveling as a Jew and what an incredible experience that is to connect with some part of yourself and your family and to see a piece of history. When I traveled in sort of Central Europe and was like, oh, I look like these people. I'm finally living with people I look like. Like, this is where my people come from. We all look the same. And it turns out their food, they'll call it something different, but that's the food that my grandmother made. That was an incredible experience for me. We want to create that for other students as well. So I think that's a piece of it. I think we've been good about saying, go to Israel and create as many experiences as possible. And last year at Stanford, we sent almost 300 Stanford students, undergrads and graduate students, on various trips to Israel, which is a remarkable number. We have not, I think, yet done as good a job of saying there's a Jewish world out there that isn't just here and isn't just there. It's actually all over the place. And how can we get you to take on a Jewish set of lenses when you travel? And I think for our students in particular, they don't come to Stanford, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong on this. They don't come to Stanford because they're looking for a particular Jewish experience. If your Jewish identity and a particular vision of what it means to be Jewish in college is what you are looking for, Stanford is probably not the top of your list. You're coming to Stanford for a million other reasons. And I think this is worth thinking about. Stanford's not exceptional here. I think this is actually true of most college students. They're looking for a university experience when they go to college, and the Jewish identity they bring is one slice of that identity. And the experiences they have while they're there, good and bad, grow that identity, shrink that identity, bring up different questions. That's where a Hillel, I think, can be really crucial in creating space that hopefully, and this should link what I'm saying now back to the beginning, create space where every student who thinks Jewish is some part of who I am, it's some set of questions I bring to the world, there's a place and a group of people, my peers and also a staff, who want to help me navigate that, who want to help me understand what it means and deepen it and understand it better and ask better questions of it, because the college experience that I'm coming for is about becoming a critical thinker, it's about establishing myself in a career, and it's about learning who I am as a human being. I think there is a Jewish lens for all of those things, but it's not necessarily the way all of our students are thinking. These students actually might be different in that, like these three, we get a set of students who show up at the beginning and say, for all the reasons I chose this university, I'm also here as a Jew. So Hillel, what do you have for me? They have expectations of us. Most of our Jewish students don't. We have to go hunt them down instead and make it enticing and appealing for them to come and be part of this so that we can open up that whole other world and help them see that like being Jewish is a lifelong thing. We don't want college to be a vacuum in that space, and we want them to be growing as Jews as they're growing as human beings. We have to go find them. We'll say here Zionism and Israel are sometimes an obstacle to that kind of engagement, not necessarily because students are opposed, but because it's such a hot issue and because it's so complicated and because they don't feel like experts. And they, with all respect, are relatively terrified of showing up in spaces where they're not expert and where they don't know what they think already, which I recognize is counter to what we say is happening in university. But so far in my experience, I think it's true, and there's actually an increasing body of research to sort of back this up. When they don't feel like experts, they don't want to engage, not because they don't think it's important, but because it costs too much. It's sort of too hot to go into that space, and they have plenty of other things to do and think about and places to be. And so they'll go other places and do those other things. If we want Jewish to be a place where they show up, then we have to find a way to make sure that Israel is a point for them to engage around, but doesn't feel like the litmus test about whether they are in or out. And that's not obvious, I think, off campus in the way that it becomes obvious when we're on campus. And then I'll stop.
Wonderful, thank you. So are there questions?
I want to raise a question. I've been to Israel 10 times. I spent a sabbatical there. I sent my 3 children for high school there. So I'm very much concerned about Israel. However, there's one thing I did not hear from any of you. I recently did a study with heads of educational programs, and they said to me they don't want to study Torah, not Orthodox Torah, even liberal Torah. Why? Because they've got too many personal problems which Judaism does not address. The teachers don't talk about their lives as it is, but they want to give them something to do to solve the problems. No, we live in an age of psychology today, and we have to understand what's going on in the kishka of the individual, and I didn't hear that among any of you here today. Maybe it's because my hearing aids don't listen well, but that's what I'm getting. No information at that level. Please address the subject.
I'll say really briefly, because I know we're short on time. I think that's a huge part, actually, of what we do. I think the subject for this panel was more about Israel and the Zionism and the questions of Jewish peoplehood, not what is the totality of the way in which we're supporting Jewish students on campus. We spend most of our time, unless there's a crisis, dealing with that totality of experience.
Rush off in vain. That's the point. See, too many kids aren't going. Too many kids don't care. But you can talk to them as people, as individuals, and you'll find that there are deep problems that they have. And they want to say, what is Judaism of value to me? What value is it?
So
why should I get involved in other things?
I'll just jump in with 2 things. I think that's a great point, and I think you are right that Judaism has something to say to our kishkas. And sure, we didn't particularly address the idea.
Not what it says.
Okay.
No, it's how you deal with it.
Sure.
That's different.
Yes, granted.
Tracy, what do you want to
2
say?
things. One, there is no Orthodox Torah and there is no liberal Torah. There is Torah. There is no Orthodox Torah, there's no Reform Torah, there's no Conservative Torah, there's no Republican Torah. Torah is Torah. It is something for all of us. And second, Rabbi K is the head of a Hillel that is launching not 1, but 2 fellowships for Torah learning next quarter. So rest assured that this is on the minds of the leaders of the Jewish tomorrow, the professionals dealing with the Jewish tomorrow, and may we all continue to be immersed in Torah as we think about these other issues.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go to the next question.
I just want to address the J2 movement. You're S Street. I'm J Street.
J
movement.
Street. Okay.
J Street. First of all, you are extremely articulate and well worded, well embraced in the idea of justice. But I think that for me, what you are saying in relationship to justice is not balanced. I think that you are looking at a situation as if everybody was on an equal footing, but you are dealing with a people. I don't think you're anti-Zionism or anything like that, or J Street is, but you're dealing with a situation where you're looking for justice, social justice, in an area that a country is facing an existential threat throughout. And you're not balanced in that, in my opinion, J Street, not you personally, but J Street is not balanced in their recognition of
So, do you
social
have a question?
injustice. So here's my question.
Okay.
Well, I don't think that you recognize, and I would like to know, that J Street doesn't recognize, and what I'd like to know is that when you are taking this position at universities, the people that are not in J Street look upon some of those comments like apartheid, and they grab onto those, and I think it creates an enlarged population within the universities of it creates a platform for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feelings. Do you think that's true?
Do you think that's true? That's the question? Okay. Thank you. No, actually, thank you so much for saying that, because I think this is one of my favorite misconceptions about J Street U and our work. When there is an attack, when something happens in Gaza, for example, your newsfeed is entirely polarized. There are people who are basically exclusively blaming Israel as the root of all evil and only highlighting Palestinian deaths and refusing to acknowledge any Hamas responsibility for the situation in Gaza whatsoever. And then there are people who are basically spending their entire platform justifying how Israel is not possibly at fault for this in any way. J Street U's role is to take that environment and say, hold on, okay, let's actually acknowledge the harm that is happening here. Let's acknowledge the Hamas responsibility. And the reason that we have credibility to do that in the campus conversation is because we're also acknowledging what is happening to the Palestinian civilians and saying that that also is wrong. So we actually are able to take this extremely polarized campus environment. We're not creating the anti-Israel sentiment on campuses. That's something we're coming into. And our recent campaign around demolitions of Palestinian villages, which basically was taking, the front lines of the two-state solution, where settlement expansion is happening and Palestinian homes are being demolished, building a coalition around that with other progressive groups, in those conversations of will you support this campaign with us, kind of as an alternative to BDS, right, which they would otherwise be supporting. Students want to change the status quo. That's why we're in college. Basically having those conversations, I was talking about what does self-determination actually mean. I was talking to heads of progressive groups who went into those conversations saying I don't like the two-state solution because I don't support the existence of Israel. And by the end of that conversation, they were actually, I care about equality, and neither of those are really great, and maybe that's actually not the issue right now. And let's reground in values of care for people. And that's where J Street U was able to take the conversation from a pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian position, because we hold both. So we're actually transforming the campus conversation in that way, rather than inviting a swath of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment that didn't pre-exist before we got there.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question from you, in the front, and then we're gonna wrap things up. But if you have any other questions, you can talk to the speakers afterwards. So, right here.
My question is mainly for the students, but I'd also love to hear from the Hillel professionals. What are your thoughts on Hillel's standards of partnership on Israel, if it harms or hurts community building? I think especially it was telling there's such a stereotype about young college students being so polarized, yet it was really interesting to hear about your experiences engaging with Zionists and anti-Zionists, and hearing the word anti-Zionist made really a lot of people in the room squirm. So I want to kind of hear about your opinions on that.
Who wants to take this one?
I could go first.
You go first.
Go first.
Great.
Sure. Yeah, I'm with Hillel's standards of community partnership. I think what Rabbi Kay said is very well thought out, that we want to acknowledge each individual's Jewish neshama, that every single Jew has a place, but I think it's totally reasonable to say there are certain community norms. I think potentially it's always worth tweaking those. I think something that Eva has alerted me to is that sometimes the Jewish community doesn't police its rightward flank as much. And so, for example, there's a really high-profile case of Princeton disinviting a member of the Israeli government who had said some stuff that indicated that she wasn't the foremost proponent of equality. And if you held that up with the text of Hillel's Standards of Community Partnership, she was in violation of the Standards of Community Partnership. So that was the right call. If they want to revise that, fine. But I do think it's reasonable for Hillel to say, here are our standards of equality and justice. And for the moment, I'm quite okay with one of those standards being working towards there being an Israel is one of the things that is necessary for equality.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any last thoughts?
I think what they do, for me, is powerful because it does separate between the individual and the group, in the sense that you have this more private. I think people should be entitled to their own opinion. They should definitely not be turned away, regardless of what they feel as individuals. But when you are part of a group and you ask that your group be given space, you are making demands of the institution.
Fantastic. Thank you. And final word.
I am going to come out strongly just to contrast and spice things up, that I firmly think they should be revised. And that's because one of the questions on this panel was, what does Zionism mean to you? And I throughout so much of college, I'd never been able to figure out what my answer to that question was, because I knew that if I came down on the wrong side of that question, I or my activism or the way that I express my values into the world would be kicked out of the building. And so I think the way that those standards play out stifles the debate. That said, equality of people and care for other humans, Jews, Palestinians, Muslims, whoever, should be a standard, and that's a place to set red lines on the right and the left. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank our panelists so much. You brought a level of nuance, of complexity. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think when looking forward at where Zionism is going, where Jewish peoplehood is going, it's very encouraging to see young people thinking deeply about these issues, working on them. So we're in good hands. So thank you again.
What a great panel.
Yeah.